Dawn breaks over the vast emptiness of the Pacific on June 4th, 1942. The rising sun casts a pale, metallic glow across scattered clouds as a lone Japanese scout plane hums steadily through the morning sky. Beneath its wings, the ocean looks calm, too calm for what is coming. The pilot wipes sweat from his brow, eyes scanning the horizon for silhouettes that could shift the balance of the war. Then he sees it, a flat-topped ship, a spear point of American power cutting across the waves, its flight deck scarred yet defiantly active. A destroyer trails close behind, protectively slicing the water. The carrier looks strangely familiar, the distinct tower shape, the aircraft markings, the structure of its island. It can't be. The Japanese pilot's heart tightens as recognition dawns. Weeks earlier at Coral Sea, that very vessel was reported heavily damaged, possibly sunk. Yet here it is alive, operational, returning to the fight that was supposed to be over for her. The name stenciled on the hull becomes clear: USS Yorktown, the ghost the Japanese thought they had already buried. Just 6 months earlier, the Pacific War had exploded into existence with fire and disbelief. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor's battleships lay crippled in their berths, thick smoke turning a sunny Hawaiian morning into a nightmare. The mighty battle fleet of the United States, once the pride of American naval power, had been reduced to burning hulks in a span of hours. But while the battleships suffered, 3 American aircraft carriers remained untouched, absent from the harbor that day. They would become the remaining backbone of resistance in the Pacific. In that sudden shift, naval warfare entered a new reality. Battles would no longer be decided by lines of steel-clad giants exchanging shells over the horizon. Instead, the ocean's future belonged to flat decks, to aircraft launched from beyond the reach of the naked eye. The Imperial Japanese Navy already understood this transformation. Years of preparation had created the Kido Butai, a concentrated force of fleet carriers and elite aviators capable of striking swiftly and far. They had roamed the Pacific in the months after Pearl Harbor, capturing territory, smashing enemy ships, and overwhelming garrisons that had thought themselves safe. Each swift victory reinforced the belief inside Japan's high command that the United States, stunned and disorganized, could be forced to the negotiating table before its enormous industrial engine awakened. Among the American carriers now tasked with slowing that momentum was USS Yorktown, CV-5. She was not the newest ship in the fleet, nor the fastest. Commissioned in 1937, she represented a transitional generation, sturdy, versatile, and built with the lessons of earlier carrier designs. She carried roughly 90 aircraft and a crew of nearly 3,000 men who had trained tirelessly in the years before the war. Now, she would be asked to fight under conditions no Navy had ever fully tested. Massive sea battles where fleets never came within sight of each other. The first months of 1942 were a desperate chess match across the Pacific's immensity. American task forces carried out hit-and-run raids against Japanese bases, probing for weaknesses while avoiding the overwhelming strength of Japan's carriers. These actions were not decisive, but they were symbolic strikes meant to reassure the American public and remind Tokyo that the United States was not defeated. Still, the situation remained precarious. Every American carrier had to be protected, losing even one risked collapsing the thin line of resistance. In May 1942, intelligence pointed to a Japanese move toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, a thrust aimed at isolating Australia and driving deeper into the South Pacific. The U.S. could not allow that foothold to be taken. And so Yorktown steamed into the Coral Sea as part of a hurriedly assembled force, alongside the larger carrier Lexington. They entered waters where neither side could rely on surface reconnaissance alone. Instead, fragile scout planes would find the enemy, and the battle would unfold far beyond the horizon. What happened next would reshape history. For the first time, 2 carrier fleets would strike each other without a single battleship firing a shot. Aircraft launched from floating airfields would be the deciding weapons. And in that crucible, the Yorktown would be pushed to the brink of destruction. Bombers, torpedo planes, pilots fighting exhaustion and confusion. Both sides paid dearly to learn the harsh new rules of naval warfare. When the Battle of the Coral Sea ended, it did so in a haze of burning fuel slicks and shattered aircraft. The Japanese invasion force turned back, operationally a strategic success for the Americans. But the cost was severe. Lexington was lost in a thunderous explosion that shook the ocean for miles. And Yorktown, though still afloat, had suffered deep wounds. Plates had buckled, boilers were strained, aviation fuel systems were compromised. In the aftermath, many believed she would require months of repairs before being fit for service again. Yet even as she limped away from the Coral Sea, a new and far greater crisis was already forming. Japanese admirals planned to draw out and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers in a single decisive strike, an attack aimed at a tiny atoll whose name would soon echo across the world: Midway. For that plan to work, Japan believed the Americans could field at most 2 carriers. Yorktown, according to their reports, had been beaten so badly that she would not return in time, if ever. But beneath the battered decks of the U.S. Navy's wounded carrier, damage control teams had kept her alive when she should have died. They were about to give her one more chance, and that chance would change the entire direction of the Pacific War. With Yorktown limping toward Pearl Harbor, her fate, and the fate of Midway, would unfold in the frantic days ahead. The Battle of the Coral Sea entered its most violent phase on May 8, 1942. Sky and sea became a battleground where men would never lay eyes on the enemy ships they were trying to destroy. American scouts found the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikiku. Japanese scouts found Yorktown and Lexington. Within minutes, both sides launched full striking waves. The crews aboard Yorktown felt the gravity of the moment as sirens wailed, flight decks cleared, and her aircraft climbed into the hostile sky. They knew a counterattack was coming. They simply didn't know from which direction. When it arrived, it came fast. Japanese dive bombers positioned themselves high above the clouds before cutting downward through the sunlit air. Anti-aircraft guns on Yorktown erupted in controlled fury, filling the sky with dark bursts. But some attackers slipped through. Bombs fell with terrifying precision. One penetrated the flight deck near the island structure and detonated inside, erupting through compartments and sending shards of steel spraying across hangar spaces. The concussion rattled the ship's backbone. Fire roared to life, smoke rolled through corridors, and fuel lines hissed under stress. Engineers and damage control crews raced against every element that wanted the ship to die. Fire, flooding, suffocating smoke, internal systems shutting down one by one. Even so, Yorktown was comparatively lucky. The sister ship beside her, the Lexington, suffered multiple torpedo hits and catastrophic fuel vapor explosions. Flames spread uncontrollably through her guts until she had to be abandoned. A heartbreaking decision that left her crew watching the ship slip away into fire and ocean. To the Japanese aviators, seeing a carrier engulfed in smoke meant victory, and in the confusion of the battle, they believed the damage was greater and more widespread than it truly was. Observers assumed that the heavily bombed carrier, Yorktown, had either gone down or was mortally crippled like her larger companion. On both sides, scouts lost track of enemy movements. Radio reports were delayed or misread. Pilots returning from long strike missions often relied only on glimpses and guesswork. When the smoke cleared and evening shadows stretched over the Coral Sea, the Japanese counted one American carrier destroyed and another forced to withdraw. Their assessment was that the U.S. Navy had just one operational fleet carrier left in the Pacific. This would later shape their assumptions and their mistakes at Midway. But aboard Yorktown, exhaustion had not dulled determination. Engineers pumped out flooding. Fires were smothered. Gasoline systems were temporarily patched to prevent further leakage. The deck plating bent inward from bomb blasts remained, but it could still launch and recover aircraft. She was bruised, but not broken. Slowly she turned east, engines thumping irregularly, and limped toward Pearl Harbor. Men who had fought through heat and smoke now cleaned compartments scar black. The ship itself seemed to groan and vibrate under strain, as though every mile pushed her closer to final collapse. Yet she kept moving. Each hour she survived was a triumph of human endurance and naval construction. The officers and planners who examined her condition on arrival expected months in dry dock. Yorktown's frame had absorbed enormous punishment, the kind of damage that normally demanded full overhaul and delicate restoration. Her flight deck needed reinforcing. Boilers were overstressed. Internal compartments reeked of burned insulation and spilled aviation fuel. But there was no time for careful engineering. Intelligence had revealed the next Japanese target, Midway. A decisive battle was coming in a matter of days. If the Americans entered it with only Enterprise and Hornet, the odds leaned dangerously toward Japan. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced a brutal strategic truth. The United States needed Yorktown, no matter her condition. She would either go to Midway, or the U.S. might lose the entire Central Pacific. So Pearl Harbor's repair yards launched into an unprecedented feat around the clock. Welders, riggers, carpenters, electricians, thousands of hands swarmed the battered carrier. They cut away mangled steel, patched gaping holes with newly welded plates, replaced cables and fuel lines with rapid improvisation. There was no luxury of perfection. They accepted cosmetic damage, sealed what they could, and focused only on restoring fighting capability. What should have taken months was compressed into less than 3 days. Men sleeping on the dock would wake to the sound of hammers, still raining sparks into the night. By the end of that frantic effort, Yorktown was not healed. She was held together by urgency and grit. But her elevators could lift aircraft. Her boilers could push her through the waves. Her flight deck, though scarred, was operational. Her crew had returned, determined and hardened by the battle already survived. Japanese officers, studying reconnaissance reports, wrote her off. They made plans based on her absence. They believed she was gone, a wreck sitting helpless in a dockyard or rusting beneath the sea. Yet in the early days of June, as Yorktown turned west once more, she carried with her a secret the Japanese were not prepared to face, that a sunk carrier was coming back, straight toward Midway. The miracle of Yorktown's return did not happen in isolation. Beneath the visible clash of steel and aircraft, another invisible battle was underway. One fought in quiet rooms filled with radio intercepts, scattered intelligence fragments, and the sharp minds of codebreakers. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's cryptographic team at Station HYPO had chipped away at the Japanese Naval Communications Code, known as Gen 25. Piece by piece, analysts reconstructed meaning from numbers that Japanese planners believed to be impenetrable. By May 1942, enough breakthrough had been achieved to identify a single two-letter indicator that would change the war: AF. Intelligence officers suspected it referred to Midway, but suspicion was not certainty. To confirm it, they devised a simple, high-stakes ruse. Midway was ordered to send an unencrypted radio message that its freshwater system had failed. Days later, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short on water. The trap had sprung. The Americans now knew exactly where Japan planned to strike and when their carriers would come. Yorktown's resurrection wasn't just an engineering miracle. It was part of a larger plan born from quiet triumph over enemy secrecy. Every rivet hammered into her battered hull was an act of defiance backed by intelligence that said she mattered. That intelligence placed overwhelming pressure on Pearl Harbor's repair crews. The shipyard at Ford Island became a battlefield of human endurance. Thousands of men labored not against an enemy they could see, but against the relentless ticking of time. Welders worked under blistering heat. Sparks hissed into the ocean as cranes swung deck plates back into position. The scars Yorktown carried from Coral Sea were raw: scorched bulkheads, twisted beams, ruptured piping. Many systems were patched in haste, some jury-rigged with improvised materials that might last minutes or hours under combat strain. Sailors returning for shore leave found their ship transformed into a hive of frantic motion, every footstep punctuated by the metallic ring of blows on steel. This was not the measured precision of peacetime shipyard routine. It was surgery conducted in a storm, desperate yet disciplined. When the final deadline came, many repairs were technically incomplete. But the carrier floated. She powered up. She could launch planes. And above all, she could fight. That was the only standard that mattered now. The decision to send Yorktown into battle so soon rested with one man, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. He understood better than anyone the stakes of what was coming. Midway was not simply an island. It was the last forward screen guarding Hawaii. If Japan seized it, the approach to Oahu would lie open and the American position in the Pacific could collapse entirely. The enemy planned to smash the U.S. carrier force and force a negotiated peace from a weakened nation. Nimitz knew he could not allow the balance to tilt any further. He weighed the risk. A ship with fragile internals, repaired systems tested only at dockside, a hull still hiding wounds beneath fresh welds. Yet there was no room for hesitation. Yorktown sailed under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a calm, analytical commander already seasoned in the new warfare of carriers. Fletcher accepted the responsibility of taking a wounded ship into the most important battle the U.S. Navy had yet faced. His flagship might not endure what was coming, but its presence alone could change how the fight unfolded. Meanwhile, halfway across the Pacific, Japanese planners were finalizing operations with confidence bordering on certainty. Their carrier force, though slightly reduced after Coral Sea, was still the most formidable on Earth. 4 frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the core of the Midway strike force, each carrying seasoned aviators who had ushered in Japan's string of victories. Yet their intelligence calculations were fundamentally flawed. They believed the Americans could field only 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They had watched Lexington go down and assumed Yorktown had followed her. Even if some damage control miracle had kept her afloat, they reasoned, no dockyard could restore a carrier that fast. The Japanese entered Midway confident in numerical superiority. They had already buried one of the enemies that was about to face them, at least in their minds. That assumption would cost them dearly. On board Yorktown herself, the mood was complex, a mixture of war-hardened resolve and quiet anxiety. Men returned to familiar berths that now carried the smell of burned fuel and fresh welding. Decks felt uneven underfoot, welded patches echoing differently beneath boots. Beneath the patched surfaces, crews lived with a constant awareness that one more hit might bypass all their hard-won repairs. Air crews checked their aircraft with almost obsessive focus, knowing that mechanical reliability could mean life or death. The pilots and deck crews had survived Coral Sea. They had seen the ocean claim a carrier and hundreds of lives. If their ship failed them now, there would be far fewer options for escape and far fewer ships to rescue them. Still, duty overshadowed fear. They knew why they were out here, because without every available carrier, the Pacific could fall into permanent darkness. Japan's search planes, in contrast, launched at Midway expecting an easy reckoning. Their plan was precise: find the American carriers, eliminate them quickly, and secure uncontested control of the sea. But the moment of shock, the moment that began rewiring the Japanese understanding of this battle, came from a single sighting report. A scout pilot gazing downward through his viewfinder recognized an outline he had seen before. The island shape was distinctive, the radar mast arrangement unmistakable. The enemy carrier was not just another flat-deck silhouette. It appeared to be the same ship they had hit hard at Coral Sea. The aircrew transmitted what they saw with professional calm, but their message carried disbelief between every coded syllable. How could an enemy carrier struck so violently be here again, fully operational, launching fighters into the sky? For Japanese commanders, that single miscalculation injected doubt into what had been a perfectly constructed narrative of victory. They now faced not 2 American carriers, but 3. And one of them was a ghost they had already claimed as dead. The final edge in this approaching confrontation wasn't armor or raw firepower. It was the technological margin that allowed Yorktown to see danger coming before it arrived. Her radar systems, though crude by modern standards, could detect approaching aircraft long before the Japanese pilots could spot the ship visually. Those additional minutes were invaluable. They gave fighter directors time to scramble Wildcats into intercept positions. They allowed anti-aircraft crews to prepare firing solutions. In carrier battles, time was ammunition, and Yorktown had just enough to matter. The Japanese, relying heavily on visual spotting and outdated assumptions, entered the fight at a disadvantage they did not immediately understand. They would learn it only when American fighters began clawing through their formations as they raced toward this supposedly sunk carrier. Every decision, every repair, every intercepted code fragment now converged onto a single point in history. Yorktown, scarred and battle-worn, was sailing straight toward the place where she would meet her fate a second time, but not before altering the direction of the entire war. Life aboard Yorktown in the days before Midway carried a tension unlike any other. The repairs done at Pearl Harbor were visible everywhere. Freshly welded seams glinting along the hangar bulkheads, temporary patchwork over what had once been bomb-torn decks, steel plates slightly mismatched in color and texture. The ship felt different underfoot. Crew members spoke quietly about the creaks and vibrations that hadn't existed before Coral Sea, the little reminders that their home was damaged beneath the surface. Yet they moved with confidence born not from illusion, but from familiarity with hardship. They had fought for the ship's survival and were prepared to do so again. Pilots checked their aircraft with meticulous care. Deck crews rehearsed aircraft recovery drills under the burning Pacific sun, ignoring the lingering smell of smoke that clung to ventilation ducts. Meals were quick, sleep shorter, minds sharper. Every man knew that this time, they were sailing to meet a superior enemy, one who believed the Americans should already be finished. Even in moments of quiet, Yorktown carried an emotional weight that hung over her decks like humidity. Many sailors had lost close friends aboard Lexington, and some had been transferred over to Yorktown when their original homes sank into the Coral Sea. The memories followed them, the thunder of explosions, the flames rising from the flight deck, the desperate leap into the water. They did not speak about it much. They did not need to. Each patch of blackened steel beneath their boots was itself a reminder of what war demanded. Their ship was more than a vessel. It was proof that survival was still possible. That alone gave them strength. Far above the American fleet, Japanese reconnaissance crews combed the ocean with practiced vigilance. They understood how vital it was to locate the enemy first in a carrier battle. Their aircraft fanned out from the carriers of the Kido Butai, searching for any trace of American presence. From the cockpit of a long-range scout plane, the pilot surveyed endless waves broken only by sunlight. He scanned the horizon systematically, adjusting altitude and angle, while the radio operator kept notes. Hours into the search pattern, faint shapes began to rise out of the shimmering distance. A carrier, destroyer escorts, wake trails indicating speed and intent. The enemy was here and ready. As the Japanese plane drew closer, distinctions became sharper. The superstructure, the layout of the flight deck, the aircraft configuration, all familiar. The pilot steadied his view, heart ticking faster in silent realization. This wasn't just any carrier. This was one they had already fought, one they had reported as destroyed. Yet she was here, engines driving her into the wind as aircraft rose from her deck. He relayed the sighting, calm in tone, but electrified in meaning. The enemy he stared at below should have been nothing more than a smoldering memory. Instead, she had returned as if resurrected. This moment of recognition sent a ripple through the Japanese command structure. Confusion crept in, veiled behind the professional language of their radio traffic. Their earlier assumptions that American carrier strength had been crippled no longer held. Instead of overwhelming force, they now faced a battle where parity was closer than expected. Decisions made confidently the day before now seemed suddenly incomplete. The fog of war thickened, not from lack of information, but from disbelief in what new information revealed. Japan had underestimated not just American ships, But American capability, the speed of repair, the determination to fight, and the unwavering resolve to return even when the odds insisted otherwise. For the Americans aboard Yorktown, the Japanese discovery brought no surprise. They had never expected to remain hidden for long. Radar operators monitored incoming echoes. Fighter direction officers calculated intercept vectors. The ship's very presence in these waters was a wager that exposure would lead not to destruction, but to a chance, a single opportunity to strike back and shape the battle's outcome. Against an enemy that held numerical and experience advantages, Yorktown carried something different, awareness that this might be her final mission. That knowledge carried its own clarity. There would be no retreat if things went wrong. Either the Japanese carriers would burn, or she would complete the sacrifice that began at Coral Sea. Technology itself formed the last, fragile margin between life and death. Yorktown's radar arrays rotated continuously, searching long before human eyes could see incoming danger. Those few extra minutes of warning would give fighters time to launch, anti-aircraft crews time to swing their guns skyward, and pilots a chance to strike before the enemy descended upon them. Yet radar was not a shield, only an early alarm. The ship remained physically wounded, her flight deck patched, her internal structure stressed. A single torpedo or well-placed bomb could tear open damage that repairs had only barely concealed. The crew understood that their ship's survival depended as much on fighting spirit and trained reactions as on hardened steel. Now, every angle converged. Intelligence had brought them here. Emergency repairs had made the impossible possible. Leadership had committed them to the decisive fight. Japanese overconfidence had left them blind to the threat resurging before their eyes. And the men aboard Yorktown, steeled by trauma and trust in one another, braced for the battle that would push them to their limits. The stage was fully set. The sea was deceptively calm. Engines rumbled below deck. Flight crews stood ready at their aircraft, goggles down, hands steady, waiting for the order. High above, Japanese scouts banked away, speeding back to their carriers with the message no one expected to send. The ghost ship lived, and soon, the hunters would descend upon her once again. The sun climbed higher on June 4th, 1942, as the opposing fleets edged closer to a confrontation that would define the Pacific. The Americans struck first. At roughly 10:20 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown tore through the sky and plunged upon 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Within minutes, explosions ripped open their flight decks. Flames engulfed planes laden with fuel and bombs. Veteran Japanese aviators who had dominated the Pacific for months were suddenly consumed by fire and chaos. One carrier after another transformed into a burning inferno, black smoke rising into the heavens like a signal that the balance of power was shifting right there and then. But the battle was far from finished. The last remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu, commanded by the resourceful and unyielding Taman Yamaguchi, launched a counterstrike aimed at the heart of the American formation. They knew there were multiple U.S. carriers in the area, but which one to strike first? Radar operators aboard Yorktown detected incoming aircraft well before they crested the horizon. The orders were immediate and urgent. Launch fighters. Wildcat pilots sprinted toward their machines, engines roaring awake as ammunition belts clattered into position. On the flight deck, the scent of fuel mixed with the faint odor of scorched paint, remnants of Coral Sea that never fully left the ship. Japanese dive bombers, sleek and deadly, appeared high above the clouds and began their descent. They screamed earthward, sunlight flashing off metal wings as they tore through anti-aircraft bursts. Yorktown's gunners tracked them with practiced instinct, shoulders pressed tight, teeth clenched, ears ringing from the constant fire. The first bombs missed, geysers of water rising just off the bow. Then one found its target, crashing through the deck near the island. The explosion thundered through compartments, knocking men from their feet and spewing flame and steel fragments in all directions. Another bomb struck close after, sending smoke billowing upward, darkening the blue sky. For a moment, the carrier shuddered. Lights flickered. Power failed. Engines fell silent. The great ship that had already survived so much began to lose speed, drifting vulnerable across the waves. Below deck, fire teams sprinted through choked hallways. Steam hissed violently from ruptured pipes. Officers barked commands that echoed through smoke and darkness. Damage control crews, those unsung heroes who fought their wars with wrenches and extinguishers, restored vital systems one by one. Within minutes, the heartbeat of the ship returned. Boilers ignited. The deck steadied. She powered forward again like a wounded animal refusing to collapse. Above them, radioed reports from attacking pilots carried a familiar assumption. The American carrier had been put out of action, likely sinking. From Hiryu, this seemed like confirmation that they had dealt with one of the U.S. flat tops. The Japanese strike group turned back, confident that their enemy's strength was again reduced. But the truth was far more unsettling. Yorktown did not die. The smoke cleared, revealing a flight deck once more operational. The emblem of the sunk carrier still glared upward, challenging the enemy to try again. Aircraft continued to launch. The ship's wake resumed its determined trail through the ocean. From afar, she looked battered but undeniably alive. The momentary pause in the air battle offered no relief. Pilots on deck refueled and rearmed in feverish haste. Wildcat fighters circled overhead, scanning for the next incoming wave. The crew moved with the quiet understanding that this reprieve would not last. The Japanese would come back. They had to. In carrier warfare, unfinished kills were dangerous mistakes, and the Japanese Navy did not tolerate loose ends. As knots of black smoke dispersed into the wind, Yorktown's men once again took their places. Medics treated the wounded. Damaged aircraft were shoved aside to make room for fresh ones. New fire hoses were laid in anticipation of more flames to come. Voices were low but urgent. Nobody allowed themselves the illusion that they had endured the worst. On the distant horizon, another danger was already emerging. Hiryu's second strike wave, torpedo bombers armed with the weapons Yorktown feared most, was climbing into the air. Commanders aboard the surviving Japanese carrier saw only opportunity. Remove the American carriers quickly before U.S. aircraft could finish the job against Hiryu herself. They did not know they were still hunting a ship they had just destroyed. Radar again picked up the signs, small blips at first, then larger. The alarm sounded. Pilots scrambled. Gunners readied. Men clenched fists around handrails as adrenaline surged. The carrier's engine strained, gaining speed so she could maneuver more aggressively. The water churned white beneath her stern. The second attack was coming, and this time, the Japanese meant to finish the kill. Yorktown, her decks still warm from the fires just extinguished, now prepared to fight her deadliest battle all over again. The short lull that followed the first attack felt fragile, like the quiet breath before a storm's final roar. On Yorktown's bridge, officers studied new radar returns marching steadily toward the screen. These were no dive bombers. Their formation was lower, faster, and more directly lethal. Torpedo planes, the kind of aircraft that turned battle-damaged carriers into shipwrecks. Hiryu's second strike was coming for the kill, believing themselves to be hunting a different American carrier. They did not yet understand that the target they had already struck, the one they believed finished, still cut defiantly through the waves below. Pilots rushed to their stations. Anti-aircraft guns swung to port and starboard. Trails of tracer fire ready to lace the sky. Damage control teams, still drenched in sweat and soot from the first attack, gripped tools and hoses, preparing to chase fire and flooding once more. Officers called for more speed, engines pushing to their limits to improve maneuverability. The ocean churned beneath the turning hull as the ship tried desperately to complicate the torpedo plane's approach angles. Moments later, the Japanese strike broke into sight. Nakajima B-5 and Kates, flying low and purposeful. American Wildcats clawed at them head-on, machine guns flashing. Some attackers burst into flame and plunged into the sea, but others pressed on, unwavering. The pilots had been trained to finish their mission, even if the cost was their own lives. Yorktown braced for the inevitable. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in deafening unison, sending walls of steel skyward. Yet torpedo planes need only one good angle and one accurate strike to change a battle. Two aircraft broke through the defensive barrage and committed to a wide attack run. The ship's helm turned sharply as commanders attempted to throw off their aim. But the ocean could not move fast enough, and neither could the wounded hull. The first torpedo slammed into Yorktown's port side. The sound was a monstrous, metallic crack that seemed to tear through bone and steel alike. A second struck close after, its explosion sending a violent jolt across the deck. The entire carrier lurched, listing sharply to port as compartments flooded in seconds. Men grabbed whatever they could to steady themselves, railings, cables, even each other, as the deck angled under their boots. Inside the ship, chaos surged back with brutal immediacy. Darkness swallowed compartments. Water poured in through ruptured bulkheads. The battle to keep the ship alive turned desperate. Pumps strained, sailors moved through waist-deep water, and officers shouted orders that were nearly drowned out by the roar of flooding and the groaning of metal. The temporary repairs made in Pearl Harbor, heroic as they were, could not withstand this second wave of punishment. The carrier that had refused to remain sunk after Coral Sea was now being dragged down by the weight of her reopened wounds. Word arrived on the bridge that power was failing once again. The list increased. Fighters in the air had nowhere safe to land. Pilots could feel dread rising as they circled overhead, the realization that the home they intended to return to might no longer exist. Eventually, Rear Admiral Fletcher accepted the truth that no commander wishes to speak. Yorktown could not continue the fight. The order came, abandon ship. It was a command every sailor dreaded hearing, and one that struck with personal betrayal. Men who had repaired her, defended her, trusted her, now had to leave their ship behind. Yet there was no hesitation. They moved efficiently despite heartbreak, assisting wounded comrades toward the rails. Lines of crew climbed down rope nets into the churning sea, careful not to be pulled under by suction or drifting wreckage. Destroyers closed in, risking submarine attack to pluck survivors from the waves. Oil coated the water's surface, clinging to faces and uniforms. The air tasted bitter with smoke and salt. Sailors kicked away debris as they swam, some clinging to rafts, others to simply hope. They watched their carrier, the vessel that had survived Coral Sea when she shouldn't have, now lying motionless and crippled again. Her proud island silhouette remained, stubbornly upright against the listing hull, as though refusing to acknowledge defeat. Many men remained in the water longer than necessary, unable to look away. Japanese torpedo pilots who circled briefly over the scene radioed their report. Another American carrier destroyed. Confident voices transmitted the news through radio waves, validation that their mission was complete. Twice now, the Japanese had declared Yorktown dead. Twice, they believed they had removed her from the war. From the cockpit view, she was finished, but the Pacific had not yet swallowed her. Beneath the surface, layers of airtight compartments continued to fight a losing battle against incoming sea. The ship was immobilized but afloat, stubborn to the end. Tug lines were prepared. Salvage teams would soon reboard her to try the impossible one more time. Yorktown had fallen silent, but she had not yet disappeared. As destroyers ferried hundreds of rescued sailors to safety, officers and crew looked back, not with despair, but with disbelief at how far she had come. Their ship had been struck again and again, each time defying the fate assigned to her. They had no way of knowing that one final threat was closing in below the surface, a shadow in the deep, preparing to deliver the blow that fires and bombs had failed to finish. The Japanese believed Yorktown destroyed. The Americans refused to surrender her. The next move would belong to a submarine stalking the dark waters nearby, ready to end the saga that fate seemed determined to prolong. Hours passed as the ocean calmed around the crippled carrier. Yorktown lay silent, a drifting giant with her fate undecided. Salvage officers cautiously returned aboard with small teams of damage control specialists. Their mission was clear and brutally challenging: stop the flooding, restore enough stability to tow her to safety, and preserve a ship that had already become a symbol of unbelievable resilience. In the dim, flooded compartments below deck, men worked in darkness broken only by lanterns and the occasional spark from makeshift repairs. Pumps groaned, hoses snaked through corridors, and every clang of metal was a battle cry against the ocean that refused to release its grip. Above them, lookouts scanned the horizon relentlessly, alert for any remaining Japanese aircraft. They did not consider the threat lurking beneath the surface. Far below, slicing through the dark blue waters, Japanese submarine I-168 stalked its target. The submarine commander, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, understood the stakes of what he had found. Destroyed American carriers meant fewer foes threatening Japan's perimeter. And here before him was a wounded enemy he believed his navy had sunk twice already. Now, he would ensure that Yorktown never returned again. Slowly, carefully, the submarine maneuvered through a screen of vigilant American destroyers. Every shift of ballast, every adjustment of the rudder carried the risk of detection. But the damaged carrier wobbled helplessly, offering an irresistible target too valuable to leave unfinished. Just after midday on June 6th, I-168 lined up its attack. For torpedoes streaked toward Yorktown, and the destroyer Hammond that was lashed to her side to provide power and pumps. The explosion that followed was devastating. One torpedo broke Hammond in half, sending the destroyer plunging so quickly that many sailors never had the chance to escape her decks. Depth charges stored aboard detonated as she sank, erupting underwater and throwing survivors into shock and confusion. Meanwhile, other torpedoes smashed into Yorktown, tearing open new wounds in the hull that no salvage team could ever hope to contain. The sea rushed in like an unstoppable tide. This time, there was no possibility of saving her. Orders were given for a second abandonment, slower, quieter, burdened by the grim recognition that this was the end. Sailors climbed rope nets again, but this time with fewer illusions. They looked back to see the flight deck sitting low, the waterline rising steadily up her sides. The destroyers that had risked everything to protect her picked up the boarding teams and watched helplessly as the ocean consumed their charge inch by inch. The night that followed was long and heavy. Men gathered on the decks of escort ships, staring into the dark direction where their carrier drifted. They talked in low voices about the battles she had endured, replaying the sounds of dive bombers and the thundering concussions of torpedo strikes. Some wept, not just for the ship, but for the friends they had lost on her decks, in her corridors, and in the waters around her. On the morning of June 7th, 1942, the Pacific claimed the USS Yorktown. She rolled slowly onto her port side, her island still pointed defiantly toward the sky, and slipped beneath the waves. Air bubbles roared upward as the sea closed over her. Her final dive was silent to many who had loved her, a quiet farewell from a ship that had refused surrender until the very last moment. The men who survived her final day felt a mix of grief and pride. They had witnessed something rare in war, a ship that had already given everything, choosing to give once more. Yorktown had sailed into the most important naval battle of the war despite fatal wounds. She had absorbed the blows meant for other American carriers, drawing fire that might have allowed the enemy to strike again more decisively. Even in her destruction, she had bought time that her fleet needed to win the fight that would turn the Pacific War around. The Japanese submarine slipped away into the ocean depths, its mission complete. Messages returned to headquarters reporting the final sinking of the American carrier. For them, the job was finished. They had slain the ghost that kept returning to defy them. But what the Japanese could not know yet was this: the battle had already been lost. Their victory over a single ship could not replace what Midway had taken from them, the core of their carrier striking force. And the absence of Yorktown the next morning would not dim the significance of what she had already accomplished. while Yorktown disappeared beneath the surface. The larger battle had already been decided. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of the Kido Butai, had been destroyed at Midway. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their loss was more than steel and engines. It was the loss of thousands of the Imperial Navy's most experienced aviators, deck crews, and officers. These were the men who had executed the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the sweeping victories across Southeast Asia, and the dominance that had seemed unstoppable just months before. Their absence left Japan, with carriers still afloat, but no seasoned hands to fly the aircraft or coordinate the complex ballet of flight operations. The Japanese carrier force was permanently broken on June 4, 1942, a fact not yet understood by every admiral, but one history would make unmistakable. When news reached Japanese headquarters that Yorktown had been sunk, it came as a grim satisfaction, but also as a troubling contradiction. Their intelligence officers believed that the ship should never have been present. To them, Yorktown's reappearance meant that the enemy could restore strength faster than expected. It meant that assumptions, the same ones that guided their Midway plan, were dangerously flawed. Japan had entered the battle confident in superiority. They left it questioning whether the United States was an enemy they could truly overpower. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the story spread quickly among sailors and officers. Yorktown had returned from the grave to fight one last time. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. By drawing the attention of Hiryu strike waves, she had spared Enterprise and Hornet from suffering the same catastrophic hits that brought her down. Without Yorktown, Japan might have succeeded in eliminating all 3 American carriers, and the battle's outcome could have been drastically different. Instead, 2 U.S. carriers lived on to carry the war forward. Midway marked a strategic turning point. No longer was the U.S. Navy the hunted force retreating across the Pacific. From this moment, the initiative shifted permanently. American shipyards, already accelerating their carrier production, would soon overwhelm any hope Japan had of catching up. Within a year, new Essex-class carriers and modern aircraft would fill the Pacific with American power. But even as those ships sailed west, the sailors who served aboard them remembered what Yorktown had endured to give them this future. In the years that followed, the memory of Yorktown's final mission became part of naval legend. She was the carrier that refused to stay dead, damaged in one battle, reborn in days, and thrown into the next without hesitation. Her crew embodied the spirit that would guide the United States through the long campaigns ahead. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the long march back toward the Japanese home islands. Sailors who had watched her sink carried that spirit into every new fight. She became a symbol of resilience, the kind that turned fear into resolve and setbacks into momentum. For Japan, her presence at Midway would remain a painful reminder. Their failure to confirm her destruction at Coral Sea, their assumption that the Americans would take months to recover, had cost them dearly. In war, a single misjudgment can shatter even the strongest war machine. Yorktown was proof of that. She had risen from beneath the calculations of the enemy, and in doing so, she had helped break the backbone of Japan's naval air power. Though lost to the depths, Yorktown would not be forgotten. Divers decades later would find her resting upright on the ocean floor, aircraft still locked in their launch positions, guns angled toward the sky as if still waiting for the next attack. Even there, in the silent dark, she looked ready to fight, a guardian that time could sink but not silence. Her war was over, but her legacy was just beginning. War has a way of reducing mighty machines to twisted metal and memories. Yet some ships carve their names in a history not through survival, but through how they face their end. USS Yorktown was one of those rare vessels. She was never the largest or the most advanced carrier in the fleet. She was simply a ship built for a purpose and manned by sailors who refused to let her purpose die. When she was bombed at Coral Sea, she stayed afloat. When she needed months of repairs, she accepted days instead. When she was struck down at Midway, she rose again long enough to defend the carriers beside her. And when a submarine finally delivered the blow that sealed her fate, she sank only after ensuring that victory not defeat, defined her final chapter. The Japanese observers who first saw her off Midway could not believe their eyes. To them, Yorktown was a ghost, a ship they had already killed once. But ghosts like hers do not linger to haunt. They rise to finish what remains undone. Her unexpected return shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility and helped set the stage for a shift in the Pacific that could never be undone. That morning, the balance of power at sea began to tilt, and Yorktown stood at the center of that turning tide. For the men who serve aboard her, she was never just steel and rivets. She was home. She was hope afloat in a Pacific that often felt endless and empty. Even as she settled onto the ocean floor, they carried her memory into every mission that followed, a reminder that endurance sometimes matters more than perfection. She showed what happens when determination and innovation stand together against overwhelming odds. Today, Yorktown rests silently in the deep, upright, guns still aimed skyward, flight deck waiting for aircraft that will never launch again. The ocean has claimed her, but has not erased her. Her story echoes through the halls of naval history, teaching a lesson every generation must relearn. In the fiercest battles, victory goes not only to the strongest, but to the ship that refuses to disappear.